The night had the kind of silence that was not comforting but heavy, like a curtain drawn too tightly against something waiting outside. On the last evening of October, neighbors spoke in cheerful voices, masks covered smiling faces, and children carried paper bags swollen with candy. Porch lights glowed amber. Jack-o'-lanterns flickered in crooked grins, and the air smelled of rotting leaves and candle smoke. It was Halloween in its most familiar form, the picture-perfect postcard that families liked to believe was safe. But in every neighborhood, behind one glowing window or beneath one grinning pumpkin, there was always a house or a figure, or a story that was not meant for children. The unsettling truth was that the most disturbing stories never came from strangers on distant highways or haunted ruins in forgotten woods. They often began with neighbors. The person across the street who waved in the mornings. The family who kept their lawn trimmed but their curtains drawn. The house that looked no different than the others until one night in late October, when it stood just a little too still, its windows reflecting nothing. As though it were watching. On Halloween, boundaries were supposed to blur. Masks offered safety, laughter disguised nervousness, and the rules of ordinary life bent under candlelight. But in those blurred hours, something darker often slipped through. A neighbor who watched too closely. A house where the door opened too slowly. A figure that moved in the yard long after children had gone home. There was one such neighborhood, quiet and ordinary, where the story still echoes through the streets like a cold draft. Those who live there do not speak of it openly anymore, but they remember. The houses remain. The porches still hold pumpkins every October, but the shadows hold more weight than the decorations. The event did not make the news in the way a national tragedy might. It was smaller, more local, more private, but it left a mark that never healed. And it began with a single house where the porch light burned longer than it should have, and where the laughter of Halloween night turned into something else. Imagine walking home from a Halloween party, the sound of children fading behind you, the bags of candy growing lighter as the street empties. You pass houses where pumpkins glow faintly, some already melted into themselves. At the end of the block, one house stands out, its windows fully lit, its front yard crowded with carved faces that do not look cheerful but cruel, teeth jagged, eyes hollow. The porch light is on, the door half open as though waiting. But no children walk up the steps. No voices call out trick or treat. The house does not welcome, it lures. A neighbor once said that on that particular night the house looked alive. The shadows behind the curtain shifted as though someone was standing there, watching each child, each adult who passed. But when anyone turned their head fully, there was nothing. Only the glow of orange candles and the faint creak of wood settling. Yet the feeling did not fade. Someone was inside. Someone was waiting. This is where the story takes root. It did not begin with screams or blood. It began with an absence. Children went to that house and did not come out quickly. Parents lingered near the sidewalk, uneasy, though they could not explain why. Some neighbors claimed the front steps seemed darker than the rest of the block, that the jack-o'-lanterns were carved with grotesque precision, not festive at all, but mocking. The night continued, candy was collected, but whispers grew. Who lived there? Why did the door stay open so late? Why did people step inside but not return right away? Every neighborhood has its secrets, but Halloween sharpens them. Some say it is the masks. Some say it is the way shadows move unnaturally beneath the glow of orange and black. What is certain is that in this quiet street, Halloween became the moment when one family, one house, and one night of trust collapsed into fear. And those who witnessed it can no longer look at their neighbors without doubt. What was seen behind those curtains? Why did footsteps echo long after the lights went out? Why even now do people cross the street before passing that yard? Halloween is meant to be about pretend danger, safe thrills, and laughter against the night. But sometimes the masks cover nothing. Sometimes the shadows are not empty. And sometimes the greatest horror lives right next door. And so the question remains, lingering like the candle smoke that refuses to fade. How well do you really know the people who live closest to you? The neighborhood had always been ordinary, and perhaps that was what made the story so unbearable. Rows of houses with similar porches and manicured lawns stretched along a single curving street. The kind of place where people waved to each other in the mornings, where mailboxes leaned in quiet alignment, and where children rode their bicycles in small clusters until the evening light grew thin. It was not a place that newspapers or television crews would ever find interesting. Its stories were meant to stay small, tucked into the spaces between fences and hedges, unspoken but understood. Every October, the houses transformed into a display of cheerful competition. Pumpkins were arranged in careful rows, cobwebs were stretched across hedges, and cardboard skeletons swayed gently in the autumn breeze. Parents spoke with pride about whose decorations were the most elaborate, and children carried with them the anticipation of a single night when rules shifted and streets belonged to them. But even among the bright displays, there was one house that stood apart. It was not neglected, nor was it abandoned. In fact, it was kept in better condition than most. The grass was always cut low, the paint on the siding never peeled, and the windows gleamed without streaks. Yet the perfection was part of the problem. The house did not carry the clutter of ordinary life. There were no bicycles leaning against the porch, no toys left forgotten in the yard, no sound of a television muffled through the walls. It was as if the house belonged not to people, but to the idea of what a house should look like. Too clean, too polished, too still. Neighbors had grown used to avoiding questions about who lived there. Some claimed to have met the occupants in passing, but their descriptions never matched. A tall man, a short woman, sometimes a child seen through the curtain but never heard in the yard. Others insisted they had never seen anyone enter or leave at all. The mail appeared and disappeared. Trash bins were placed at the curb and then returned, but there was never a clear face, never a voice that carried beyond the porch. For years, it was nothing more than a background unease, the kind that is noticed only when the seasons shift. But on Halloween, the unease grew sharper. Children were drawn to the house because of its decorations, because of the strange pumpkins carved with too much detail, because of the bowl of candy that always seemed to sit on the porch without ever running empty. Parents hesitated at the sidewalk, some refusing to let their children step closer. Others, pressured by eager voices, allowed quick trips to the door, quick knocks, quick thank yous whispered into the shadows of the open doorway. The year it happened, the air carried an unusual stillness. October had been colder than usual, and the leaves had already broken free from their branches, leaving skeletal trees lined against the dusk. The neighborhood carried its usual cheer, but there was a hesitation that could be felt if one looked closely. It was not spoken aloud, but the house with the polished siding and the glowing windows had become the center of whispered warnings. Still, Halloween demanded ritual, and ritual demanded trust. Children would always step toward the glowing porch lights, even when adults sensed that something beneath the glow was wrong. Some neighbors remembered how earlier that week, the house had been different. Curtains that were usually closed had been left open. A single lamp burned all night long, though no one appeared in the window. A package left on the porch was taken inside, but no one saw by whom. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with each day, and by the time October 31st arrived, it had wrapped itself around the block like a low fog. It is important to understand that nothing about the house broke the rules of normalcy outright. That was why suspicion never became certainty. It was not a place abandoned, nor was it marked by violence. It simply did not align with the rhythm of life that the rest of the neighborhood carried. And when life breaks rhythm, unease grows. When the night of Halloween came, the house was fully prepared. Pumpkins lined the walkway, each face more grotesque than the last, each grin stretched wider, each eye cut deeper. The porch light glowed bright, casting a warm circle onto the concrete steps. The door was decorated with a wreath of autumn leaves, but it did not look cheerful. The leaves seemed brittle, their edges curling into sharp points. And the door itself, though painted in fresh layers, appeared darker that night, as if the color had absorbed something. Neighbors recalled that the atmosphere shifted when children approached. Their laughter dimmed, their steps slowed, and their costumes seemed to wilt in the heavy air. Some said they saw shadows move behind the curtains. Others said they heard faint voices, not clear words, but whispers that carried no direction. Still, children reached for candy because children are drawn to ritual more than fear. They did what they were told Halloween was for. This was the stage, the backdrop against which everything unfolded. A neighborhood ordinary in every way but one, a house perfect in its silence, and a night when masks, shadows, and doors all blurred into something else. What mattered most was not what people saw, but what they did not see. The shapes behind the curtains that vanished when eyes adjusted, the footsteps that seemed to echo without anyone on the porch, the way the candy bowl never emptied no matter how many small hands reached inside. By the end of that night, the neighborhood would no longer speak of Halloween in cheerful tones. The house would remain standing, its siding unblemished, its windows polished, but the people who passed by it afterward would always lower their voices. And when October returned each year, no matter how many pumpkins lined the other porches, no matter how much laughter filled the streets, there was always the reminder: one house did not belong. One house was not safe. One house had swallowed something it was never meant to swallow. It began quietly, so quietly that no one recognized it as the beginning of anything at all. In the weeks that led up to that Halloween, the neighborhood was filled with the usual sounds of preparation. Hammers knocking as decorations were nailed into place, leaves raked into piles that children ran through, laughter echoing from one side of the street to the other. But threaded beneath the cheer were small fractures, the kind of disturbances that most people dismissed as imagination or coincidence. At first, it was only the lights. A single neighbor recalled how, on several occasions, the lamps inside the house at the end of the block flickered at odd hours. Not the kind of flickering that comes from faulty wiring, but something slower, deliberate, as if someone were playing with the switch. The lights would pulse in rhythm, dimming until the windows seemed dark and then flaring up again to cast sharp rectangles across the lawn. When asked about it, others claimed they never noticed, though they admitted to feeling an unease when they passed by. It was as if the house itself breathed. Then came the noises, low muffled sounds that carried through the still night. Some swore they heard the dragging of furniture across the floor long after midnight. Others described the sound of a door slamming shut and then opening again, though no one ever saw anyone enter or leave. One woman spoke of hearing a faint knocking that did not come from her own door but from somewhere across the street. It continued for several nights in a row, always at the same hour, always with the same rhythm. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. By the time she gathered the courage to open her window and listen carefully, the sound stopped, leaving only the cold wind stirring through the trees. The strangeness grew sharper when the pumpkins appeared. Most families carved their jack-o'-lanterns in the week leading up to Halloween, cheerful faces that melted into themselves after a few nights. But at the house with the polished siding, the pumpkins did not rot. They sat on the porch with carved grins too elaborate for comfort, faces that seemed less festive and more grotesque, with teeth carved into jagged lines and eyes too wide, too human. What unsettled the neighbors most was the number of them. Each night, it seemed, a new pumpkin appeared. No one saw who placed them there. No one saw anyone carrying them, but each morning the row grew longer. By the time October 31st arrived, the walkway was lined with them, every step to the porch guarded by another grotesque face. Children began to whisper about the house, inventing their own explanations. Some said that if you looked too long into the eyes of the pumpkins, you could see them move. Others said they had seen a figure behind the curtains, tall and still, standing in the exact same position no matter when you passed by. Parents dismissed it as childhood fantasy, yet they found themselves avoiding the windows when they walked by. They told their children not to stare, but children always stare longer when told not to. On the night itself, the atmosphere shifted further. The sky was darker than usual, clouds blocking the moon, and the wind moved through the street with a sharpness that cut through laughter. Families went door to door collecting candy, shouting greetings, but every time someone neared the house with the glowing windows, voices lowered. Parents kept their distance at the sidewalk, watching their children run ahead. Some children hesitated before climbing the steps, their hands tightening around their candy bags. Others ran forward without pause, but none of them stayed long at the door. Accounts differ on what happened when the door opened. Some claimed a woman answered, her face pale, her expression blank, her voice low and without inflection. Others said it was a man, tall and silent, who held out the candy without a word. Still others insisted no one appeared at all, that the candy bowl sat at the edge of the porch, replenished somehow each time it was emptied. No one could agree, but each memory carried the same unease, the sense that something waited just beyond the doorframe, hidden in the glow of the house. Stranger still were the small incidents that followed. A child claimed to have seen a figure crouched among the pumpkins, watching from between the carved grins. Another swore that when they looked back, one of the pumpkins had changed expression. Its grin stretched wider than before. Parents dismissed these fears, reassuring themselves that it was only Halloween excitement, but the unease spread. Later that night, after most children had gone home and the streets grew quiet, some neighbors reported seeing movement in the yard, a shadow gliding between the trees, a figure standing too still near the porch steps. One man said he heard whispers, soft but urgent, coming from the yard, though he saw no one there. Another recalled the sound of laughter, childlike, high-pitched, but the street was empty. By midnight, most houses had darkened, their porch lights switched off, their pumpkins extinguished. But the house at the end of the block remained fully lit. Its windows glowed brightly, its pumpkin still burned, and its door remained open just enough to show the outline of light inside. Those who stayed awake long enough to notice spoke of footsteps pacing inside, but always in the same rhythm, back and forth, as though someone was waiting for something that never arrived. When morning came, the pumpkins were still there. The porch was still decorated. The door was closed. But neighbors who walked by swore that the faces carved into the pumpkins had changed again, stretched into shapes that were no longer playful or grotesque, but something worse, mocking, watching. And so the build-up settled into place, not with one loud event, but with many quiet ones, lights that flickered when no one was inside, noises that carried when they should not have, pumpkins that multiplied in silence, shadows that stood too still, and neighbors who could not agree on what they had seen, only that each of them felt the same gnawing dread. Something was happening inside that house, something that would not remain hidden much longer. In the days that followed, fragments of testimony began to spread through the neighborhood. Each neighbor carried their own memory of that night, but none of the accounts aligned. The deeper one looked, the more the story split into contradictions, as if the house itself had warped the truth and left only fragments for people to cling to. One woman swore she saw a child's shoe left at the edge of the walkway the next morning. She said it was small, black, and scuffed, the kind of thing worn during Halloween by children in costume. She said it sat there all through the early hours until she turned her head for just a moment and it was gone. When asked about it later, no one else admitted to seeing it, though she repeated her memory without hesitation. She was certain. The shoe had been there. Another neighbor recalled something far stranger. He claimed that when he looked through the side window of the house that night, just for a moment he saw dozens of figures inside. Not people moving about, not the natural gestures of hosts offering candy, but figures standing perfectly still, facing the walls. He said their shadows stretched long across the floorboards, but their heads did not turn when the door opened. He did not knock, he did not go closer, but the image stayed with him long after the lights of Halloween faded. Then there was the question of the pumpkins. By daylight, their expressions seemed less grotesque than they had at night. The jagged teeth softened, the wide eyes dulled. But some neighbors insisted the faces had changed again. A grin that had been wide was now narrow. An eye that had once been round was now slit like a wound. One family photographed the row of pumpkins, hoping to prove the claim. But when the pictures were printed, every pumpkin looked the same. Static, ordinary, unthreatening. Still, those who walked past in person swore otherwise. Small artifacts began to circulate as well. A child brought home a piece of candy from the house that no one recognized. It was wrapped in old paper, the kind that crinkled like parchment with no brand or markings. When the parents unwrapped it, the candy inside was not chocolate or caramel, but something harder, chalky like pressed powder. They threw it away, but not before noticing the faint smell of earth clinging to it, as though it had been buried in the ground for years before finding its way into their child's bag. A man down the street claimed to have found scraps of paper in his yard the following morning. Torn edges, weathered ink, symbols scrawled that he could not understand. He burned them before anyone else could see, too unsettled to keep them. But he later described them as circles within circles, broken lines intersecting, as though they were meant to form a map or ritual. Others dismissed his account as exaggeration, but he refused to change his story. Even official notes reflected the uncertainty. Police were eventually called not for a crime, but for reassurance. Families demanded to know who lived in the house, who had placed the decorations, who had given their children candy that no one could identify. The officers who arrived that night reported nothing unusual. They walked the porch, glanced through the windows, and insisted that everything appeared in order. But in the notes, one officer scribbled to himself. Later leaked through whispers, a detail stood out. He described how when he stood near the pumpkins he heard faint scratching. He bent down, thinking perhaps it was an animal trapped nearby. But the sound stopped as soon as he leaned closer. and the pumpkins seemed to vibrate with silence, their hollow grins cutting through the air. Another officer, when pressed in private, admitted that he felt a heaviness inside the doorway, not a visible obstruction, not anything that could be described in physical terms, but a pressure against his chest, a resistance that made him step back without realizing it. He did not write this in the report. He only confessed it much later, after he had already moved away from the town. Experts were brought into the discussion, though only informally. A local historian suggested the land beneath the neighborhood once held something older, fields marked by burial mounds, farmland abandoned after strange reports. He mentioned records of families leaving the area generations earlier, citing misfortune, livestock vanishing, tools breaking without explanation. He hinted at rituals once performed to ward off mischief during harvest, rituals that may have carried forward in distorted ways. Yet he admitted there was no direct evidence. Only fragments, only rumor. A psychologist who studied the accounts later suggested something different. He argued that Halloween itself primes the mind for fear, that shadows and symbols work against the imagination until ordinary details twist into horrors. The pumpkins were grotesque because neighbors expected them to be. The noises were louder because silence had made them so. The figure at the window was nothing more than reflection layered over expectation. But even as he offered this reasoning, his words carried little comfort. People did not want to believe that imagination alone could feel so heavy. Still, the most disturbing clue was the simplest one. Multiple neighbors described hearing children's voices long after midnight. Not laughter in the distance, not echoes of earlier trick-or-treaters, but faint voices directly from the porch. Some said they heard singing, broken fragments of rhyme. Others said they heard pleading, whispers that never grew clear. Those who lived closest swore that the voices were not carried by wind. They came from inside the house, beneath the steady glow of the light that refused to go out. The contradictions piled higher with each retelling. A shoe that vanished, shadows that faced the walls, pumpkins that changed their expressions, candy that smelled of earth, paper marked with symbols, a house that appeared perfect by daylight but impossible to endure by night. Every detail conflicted, yet each carried the same undercurrent. There was something inside that house which did not belong, something that used the ritual of Halloween as a doorway, and the evidence, though fragmented, was enough to leave the community raw. They did not know if what they saw could be trusted. They did not know if their memories had been twisted by fear. But they did know one thing. The house at the end of the block had swallowed more than candy that night. It had taken certainty, leaving only the ache of doubt behind. The house remained silent and ordinary in daylight, but the people around it changed. It was not sudden. No one screamed in the streets. No one fled with belongings packed in the middle of the night. Instead, it began with small hesitations, pauses in conversation, glances that lingered too long toward the end of the block. Fear did not arrive with a storm. It settled like dust, thin but inescapable, coating everything until it could not be ignored. Parents were the first to feel it most heavily. They had sent their children to the glowing porch. They had trusted the tradition, and now they could not forget the details their children whispered afterward. A child waking in the night, insisting they had seen one of the pumpkins pressed against their window, its carved grin fogging the glass as if it breathed. Another child refusing to eat candy for weeks, terrified that what was inside the wrappers was not meant for them. These were not tantrums or passing fears. They were rooted in something deeper, and the weight of guilt fell hardest on the adults who had led them to the door. The children carried the unease in different ways. Some grew restless, their sleep broken by sudden cries, their games quieter in the daylight. Others withdrew, unwilling to walk past the house even with parents at their side. A few whispered to each other in schoolyards about voices that followed them, shadows that trailed too close. Teachers reported unusual behavior, students staring at nothing for long stretches, drawing shapes in their notebooks that looked like circles and crooked faces. The joy that once accompanied the season drained away, leaving only silence when the topic of Halloween returned. Neighbors stopped gathering in the same way. Where once the street had been filled with casual conversation, now there was distance. People crossed the road to avoid the house, but in doing so, they avoided each other as well. The sense of shared community fractured. Each family carried its own private version of the story, and those versions clashed. Some clung to rational explanations. Children overexcited, lights misinterpreted, noises carried by the wind. Others believed something darker had slipped through that night. Neither side trusted the other fully, and the tension hollowed out the warmth that had once defined the street. Anxiety found its way into the smallest details. Doors were locked earlier. Curtains were drawn tighter. Porch lights were left off even before the sun fully set. For some, it became unbearable to live so close to the house. One family moved away within weeks, selling their home quietly and without explanation. Another couple began spending nights elsewhere, claiming visits to relatives but leaving their own windows dark for long stretches. The neighborhood thinned, not physically but emotionally. Presence without connection, houses filled with silence rather than life. There were also those who began to unravel more visibly. One man who had sworn he heard children's voices long after midnight fell into a pattern of walking the block each night, circling the house as though to reassure himself it had not changed. Neighbors whispered about him, but none confronted him directly. He lost weight, his eyes grew hollow, and his steps grew slower, but still he walked. He stopped only after collapsing on his lawn one evening, and though he survived, he no longer spoke of what he had seen or heard. Fear infected the language of the place. Children spoke in fragments, avoiding full sentences when the house was mentioned. Adults lowered their voices, changing the subject quickly if anyone pressed too far. Even laughter felt brittle, forced in gatherings where the topic was avoided. The silence became its own presence, a shadow heavier than any figure behind a curtain. What had once been superstition, a small unease noticed only on October nights, had spread into every hour of every day. For some, the psychological weight became unbearable. They began to dream of the house even when they lived streets away. Dreams of standing at the porch, unable to turn away, while the pumpkins stared back with faces that changed each time. Dreams of voices calling softly from the doorway, not in malice but in invitation, asking to be let in. Waking left them no comfort. The dreams bled into the mornings, leaving them tired, withdrawn, unable to speak of what their minds replayed. Paranoia grew strongest among those who had children. They began to watch not only the house but each other. Whispers spread that some families knew more than they admitted, that some had allowed their children to linger too long at the doorway, that some carried secrets they refused to share. Accusations never became direct, but they lived in every look, every pause. The street was no longer a place of neighbors. It was a place of suspicion. The emotional collapse was not sudden and loud. It was slow, suffocating. One season ended, then another began, and still the heaviness lingered. By spring, the pumpkins were gone, the wreath had withered away, and the porch light was off. But the silence of the house was not comforting. It was worse. Absence could not erase the memory of what had been seen, what had been heard. It only deepened the uncertainty, reminding the neighborhood that nothing had been explained, nothing had been solved. Children grew older, but they carried the memory with them. Some refused to go out on Halloween at all. Others left candy untouched, suspicious of what might be inside. Adults pretended not to notice, but the traditions that once brought them together now fractured further apart. The holiday that had once filled the street with laughter now left it hollow, the sound of footsteps hesitant against the pavement. And so the true impact of that night was not in what was seen or found, but in what it left behind, a community stripped of trust, parents hollowed by guilt, children scarred by voices they could not forget, a place where silence spoke louder than words, and where each passing October brought back the same question, whispered but never answered. What had really happened on that porch, and what had been invited in when the door opened? The questions never stopped, but the answers fractured into theories that refused to align. Some came from officials, others from neighbors who whispered late into the night, and still others from those who stood outside the story and tried to force it into categories they could understand. Yet none of it settled. Each explanation cracked under its own weight, leaving behind only more unease. The first investigation was carried out quietly. The police had no crime to report, no missing persons to file, no evidence to seize. Still, they were compelled by the voices of parents who demanded to know who lived inside the house at the end of the block. The officers who visited the property reported nothing unusual. The house was clean, the porch tidy, the pumpkins discarded by spring. The mailbox held bills and advertisements like every other house. Their conclusion was simple. There was no case, no danger. The matter was closed on paper, but the neighborhood did not accept it. Whispers spread that the police had not told everything. One neighbor claimed to have seen officers stepping out of the house pale and uneasy, whispering to each other in tones not meant to be heard. Another swore he overheard one officer say that the air inside was suffocating, as if the house itself pressed inward. None of this appeared in reports. None of it could be proven. But secrecy breeds suspicion, and soon many believed the officials were hiding something. Historians were drawn into the conversation as well. One man from the county library began combing through old land records, searching for what might have stood before the neighborhood was built. He found accounts of farmland abandoned in the late 19th century. Families moved away without selling, their property left to rot, their names fading from census records. A handful of letters survived in archives speaking of strange noises in the fields, livestock disappearing, harvests that failed without explanation. There was even mention of gatherings at the edge of the land, circles of people who lit fires at night and carved symbols into wood. Nothing in the record proved that the current house sat on the exact same ground, but the suggestion was enough to stain the place with history. Others turned to superstition. Some believed the house was never meant to be built at all, that the land itself resisted habitation. They pointed to the perfection of the siding, the gleam of the windows, the grass that never grew wild. It was too neat, they said, because it was maintained by something not human, a mask of normalcy covering something older, something patient. They argued that the house did not belong to a family, but to the land itself, and that each Halloween it opened an invitation, waiting for children to step across the threshold so it could feed on belief, fear, or something worse. Psychologists offered more rational theories. They described a phenomenon of collective hysteria, where a single night of heightened emotion caused neighbors to misinterpret what they saw. Pumpkins appeared grotesque because fear sharpened their features. Lights flickered because minds primed for horror created patterns in random pulses. Children carried home stories of voices because suggestion planted them there. According to this view, the house was nothing more than an empty vessel filled with the imagination of those who lived around it. Yet even as these explanations were offered, those who lived closest shook their heads. Fear may explain exaggeration, but fear does not explain symbols drawn on scraps of paper, candy wrapped in unmarked parchment, or the way footsteps echoed long after the night ended. Conspiracies began to spread, fed by the silence of officials and the stubbornness of memory. Some whispered that the house belonged to no family at all, but to an organization that used Halloween as cover. Experiments, they said. Observations of children, tests of behavior under ritual conditions. The candy was not candy, the pumpkins were not decorations. They were instruments, tools for measuring something no one outside was meant to understand. Others argued it was not an organization but a single person, someone hidden in plain sight, a neighbor who lived under another name, who moved through the community unseen until October drew close. The house in this theory was a stage for a performance only they understood. Then came the paranormal theories. Some believed the house was not simply haunted but hollow, not a home but a doorway. Its lights flickered because something pressed against it from the other side. Its pumpkins changed because they were not carved by human hands but shaped by something slipping through. The children who claimed to hear voices were not imagining. They were hearing what seeped through the doorway, faint but insistent, the sound of whatever waited beyond the threshold. In this telling, Halloween was not the cause but the opportunity. The night when masks made passage easier, when the boundary between invitation and intrusion thinned, contradictions fueled every version. For each who dismissed the event as hysteria, another brought up the shoe that vanished, the officer who admitted to heaviness, the faces that changed in the dark. For each who argued it was a cult, another demanded why no ritual remnants were found. For each who whispered of government experiments, another asked why the house remained untouched year after year, its perfection uninterrupted. Every explanation left gaps. Every theory unraveled just enough to let dread seep through. The investigations, official, historical, psychological, conspiratorial, did not close the story. They fractured it further, splitting it into versions that each person carried privately. But the effect was the same no matter the belief. The neighborhood was left with a truth that no theory erased. On that night, something happened at the house with the glowing windows, and no one could fully explain what it was. Theories could not stop the unease. They only deepened it, reminding everyone that certainty was gone. The story of the house did not end with evidence or confession. There were no arrests, no official closure, no final explanation that could settle the unease. Time moved forward as it always does, but the neighborhood never returned to what it had been. What lingered was not just fear, but a deep erosion of certainty, the kind that reshapes lives even in silence. Years passed, and yet each October the atmosphere thickened. The pumpkins returned on porches across the street, but none carried joy. They were carved out of obligation, gestures made because the ritual demanded it, not because anyone truly celebrated. The laughter of children dulled, their steps hesitant, their eyes drawn always toward the house that had become the center of every whispered memory. Some families stopped altogether, locking their doors and leaving their lights off on Halloween night, unwilling to risk even the smallest connection to what had happened. The house itself did not change. It stood as it always had, polished, neat, immaculate. Its windows gleamed under the sun, its siding free of cracks, its yard empty of clutter. By day, it was indistinguishable from the rest of the neighborhood. But by night, and especially by October's end, it shifted again. Lights flickered in patterns too deliberate to ignore. Curtains stirred without wind. And though no one dared to admit it aloud, some still swore that the pumpkins appeared again, not carved by human hands, but arranged in silent lines along the walkway as if placed by something unseen. The greatest wound was not what was seen, but what was never explained. The fragments remained, shadows inside that faced the wall, candy that smelled of earth, a shoe that vanished, voices too faint to ignore. Each detail alone could be dismissed, but together they formed a picture that no theory could erase. And so the story lived on, a wound carried in silence, a story that bled into the bones of the place. It was not only fear that settled, but doubt. Neighbors no longer trusted what they saw. A flicker in the corner of the eye became more than imagination. A knock at the door after midnight became a threat rather than coincidence. The human mind, once broken open, cannot be sealed again. The children who grew up on that street carried the weight into adulthood, their memories half-formed but never forgotten. They remembered the porch light that refused to go out, the pumpkins that seemed to watch, the voices that whispered from a place no one could find. The house remains ordinary in daylight, unspeakable in memory. And each year, as Halloween approaches, questions return. Some passers-by still claim to hear faint sounds when they near the yard, whispers or footsteps too soft to be explained. Others say the air feels thicker, the ground colder, as if the land itself remembers. The most unsettling part is that nothing ever escalated. No tragedy unfolded that could be pointed to, no body was found, no crime reported. What makes the story unbearable is the absence. Something was seen, something was felt, something was heard, and yet nothing was confirmed. It is the emptiness of certainty that makes the story heavier than violence. For how can one grieve or heal when nothing can be proven real? Theories continue, whispered each autumn. Some still argue that the house is a hollow space, a structure built on land that refuses to forget. Others suggest that it is not the house at all, but the people who made it so, their fear feeding into the place until it grew teeth of its own. The most disturbing theory, though, is the simplest one, that nothing happened, that everything, the lights, the pumpkins, the voices, was nothing more than imagination layered on imagination. And yet, if that were true, why do so many share? Memories that cannot be reconciled? Why do their voices still break when they speak of that night? It may never be answered. Perhaps it was hysteria. Perhaps it was ritual. Perhaps it was something that pressed against the veil on a night when the veil was thin. What remains is not explanation, but effect. A neighborhood fractured. A holiday that no longer carries joy. A house that cannot be approached without unease. And so the story closes not with resolution, but with a question. When the lights flicker again, when the pumpkins return, when the door opens just enough to show the glow inside, what exactly waits behind it? A family no one truly knows? A shadow with no face? Or nothing at all? Nothing but the reflection of fear itself, staring back at every person who dares to look too closely. The porch light still burns each October, The pumpkins still watch with carved grins that seem to shift when no one is looking. And each Halloween night, children still whisper about the house, daring each other to step closer, though few ever do. The story does not end because the house does not leave. It waits, silent and perfect, until the ritual begins again. And perhaps that is the most disturbing part of all. That horror does not always strike once and vanish. Sometimes it remains, patient and still, living in the corner of an ordinary street, waiting for the next knock at the door. So as another Halloween approaches, the question is left for you to carry. When you step into the night surrounded by masks and laughter, when you see a porch light glowing just a little too brightly at the end of the block, will you walk past, without looking, or will you turn your head and see what should never be seen? Because sometimes the most terrifying stories are not about strangers or haunted ruins. Sometimes they live across the street, sometimes they are your neighbors, and sometimes they are still waiting.